In the darkest corners of human history, there are chapters so chilling, they echo through time as haunting reminders of our capacity for cruelty. Today, we delve into the horrifying annals of World War II, where the Nazis perpetrated unspeakable atrocities in the name of pseudoscience. In this video, we will uncover the grim details of heinous experiments conducted in the shadows of the Holocaust, from freezing trials that pushed the limits of human endurance to high-altitude experiments testing the boundaries of life itself, and the sinister investigations involving mustard gas and medical sadism. Brace yourselves for an exploration into the abyss as we confront the darkness of the past, seeking understanding and ensuring that the voices of the victims are never silenced. This is a journey into the heart of inhumanity, a stark reminder that we must never forget the atrocities of history. Viewer discretion is advised. Medical experiments at Auschwitz. The medical experiments conducted at Auschwitz, particularly by Dr. Joseph Mengele, one of some of the most heinous and infamous atrocities committed by the Nazis during World War II. Dr. Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, conducted gruesome experiments on inmates, primarily twins and individuals with genetic conditions. These experiments were characterized by their extreme cruelty, lack of scientific merit, and utter disregard for human life. 1. Sterilization experiments. Mengele and his colleagues conducted sterilization experiments on both men and women. Inmates were subjected to surgical procedures, including the removal of reproductive organs, to test various sterilization techniques. These experiments aim to further the Nazi goal of preventing the reproduction of certain undesirable groups. 2. Twin experiments. Mengele had a particular fascination with twins, believing that studying them could unlock the secrets of heredity. Twins were subjected to a range of sadistic experiments, including injections with lethal substances, surgeries without anesthesia, and deliberate infection with diseases. Mengele would often compare the reactions of the twins to observe the genetic similarities and differences. 3. Eye color experiments. In an attempt to understand the inheritance of eye color, Mengele injected different substances into the eyes of inmates, causing excruciating pain and often resulting in permanent damage or blindness. These experiments were part of the broader pseudo-scientific racial studies promoted by the Nazis. 4. Genetic and anthropological studies. Mengele conducted various experiments aimed at advancing the Nazi ideology of racial purity. This included measurements of body parts, collection of blood samples, and other pseudo-scientific studies intended to support the concept of Aryan racial superiority. 5. Inhumane conditions. In addition to the direct experiments, Auschwitz prisoners, including those who were not part of Mengele's studies, faced horrific living conditions, malnutrition, overcrowding, disease, and brutal treatment by the SS guards contributed to the suffering and death of countless inmates. 6. Lack of scientific rigor. It's crucial to note that these experiments lacked any scientific validity. Mengele's methods were brutal, and the results were often inconclusive or irrelevant. The primary purpose was to satisfy the twisted curiosity of the perpetrators rather than to advanced scientific knowledge. The medical experiments at Auschwitz represent a dark chapter in the history of human cruelty. The victims endured unspeakable suffering, and many lost their lives due to the sadistic actions of Mengele and his collaborators. It's important to remember and educate about these atrocities to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. Freezing experiments. The freezing experiments conducted by the Nazis during World War II were a series of inhumane tests that subjected prisoners to extreme cold conditions. These experiments were carried out to study the effects of cold exposure and find ways to treat hypothermia, primarily for the benefit of the German military. The victims, often political prisoners and concentration camp inmates, face unimaginable suffering as they became subjects in these cruel and scientifically unjustifiable trials. 1. Purpose and context. The primary objective of the freezing experiments was to gather data on how the human body responds to prolonged exposure to cold temperatures. The Nazi scientists, driven by their pursuit of military advantage, sought information that could potentially aid German soldiers fighting in harsh winter conditions on the Eastern Front. 2. Test subjects. Concentration camp inmates, particularly those deemed expendable or selected for medical experimentation, were the unfortunate subjects of these freezing experiments. The victims included both men and women, often stripped of their clothing before being exposed to the extreme cold. 3. Experimental conditions. The experiments took place in a controlled environment where temperatures could be manipulated. Victims were either immersed in ice-cold water tanks or left outdoors in freezing temperatures for extended periods. Some were forced to stand naked in sub-zero temperatures, enduring the brutal conditions until the scientists deemed the experiment concluded. 4. Lack of consent. Like many other Nazi experiments, the freezing experiments lacked any form of consent from the victims. The prisoners were forcibly subjected to these life-threatening conditions without regard for their well-being or basic human rights. 5. Medical procedures. During and after exposure to extreme cold, the victims underwent various medical procedures, including measurements of body temperature, pulse, and respiration. Autopsies were often conducted to examine the physical effects of hypothermia on internal organs. 6. Ethical violations. The freezing experiments represented a gross violation of medical ethics, as they were conducted without any scientific rigor or legitimate medical purpose. The results obtained were of little value, as the experiments lacked proper controls and adherence to ethical standards. 7. Outcomes and casualties. Many of the victims subjected to freezing experiments did not survive. The harsh conditions led to severe frostbite, hypothermia, and ultimately death. Those who did survive often suffered permanent physical and psychological damage as a result of the extreme cold exposure. These freezing experiments, along with other atrocities committed during the Holocaust, serve as a stark reminder of the depths of inhumanity that can be reached when ethical standards are abandoned in the pursuit of scientific or military goals. Remembering and educating about these horrific events is crucial to preventing the recurrence of such atrocities in the future. High-altitude experiment. The high-altitude experiments conducted by Nazi scientists during World War II were a series of inhumane tests aimed at studying the effects of low atmospheric pressure and oxygen deprivation on the human body, led by Dr. Sigmund Rascher. These experiments were conducted primarily at the Dachau concentration camp. The information gathered from these experiments was intended to benefit the German Air Force, especially in developing equipment for high-altitude flights. Here are more details about these chilling experiments. 1. Purpose of the experiments. The primary goal was to investigate the physiological and medical consequences of low atmospheric pressure, similar to conditions experienced at high altitudes. The Nazis sought to develop protective measures and equipment for their pilots, particularly those engaged in high-altitude missions. 2. Pressure chambers. Inmates, often political prisoners or individuals deemed expendable, were placed in low-pressure chambers. These chambers simulated high-altitude conditions. By reducing atmospheric pressure, the victims were then subjected to various altitudes to observe the effects on their bodies. 3. Decompression experiments. Some experiments involved rapid decompression, simulating conditions encountered when aircraft rapidly ascend to high altitudes. Inmates were exposed to sudden changes in pressure to observe the impact on their organs, particularly the lungs and circulatory system. 4. Lack of protective measures. Victims were not provided with any protective gear or oxygen supply during the experiments. The Nazis wanted to study the natural physiological responses to low pressure, with a particular focus on identifying potential weaknesses and vulnerabilities. 5. Fatal consequences. The experiments often resulted in severe injury or death for the subjects. Symptoms of altitude sickness, including hypoxia, oxygen deficiency, nausea, dizziness, and loss of consciousness, were observed. The high mortality rate among the victims underscored the ruthlessness and lack of concern for human life demonstrated by the Nazi regime. 6. An ethical nature. As with other Nazi experiments, the high-altitude experiments were conducted without the informed consent of the victims. Many of the participants were selected arbitrarily, and they had no choice but to endure the life-threatening conditions imposed on them. 7. Pseudoscientific practices. The experiments lacked scientific rigor and were driven more by the Nazis' ideological goals than by genuine scientific inquiry. The data collected were often of little practical value, and the methods employed were inconsistent with ethical research practices. The high-altitude experiments, along with other atrocities committed during the Holocaust, highlight the profound moral and ethical failures of those who conducted these inhumane studies. Remembering and acknowledging these historical horrors is essential to prevent the recurrence of such atrocities and to honor the memory of the victims. Mustard gas experiments. The mustard gas experiments conducted by Nazi scientists during World War II were a series of inhumane tests involving the use of sulfur mustard, commonly known as mustard gas, led by Dr. Kurt Blom. These experiments were aimed at developing more effective chemical warfare agents. The victims of these experiments, often prisoners of war or concentration camp inmates, were subjected to the devastating effects of mustard gas to study its impact on the human body. Here are more details about these appalling experiments. 1. Purpose of the experiments. The primary objective of the mustard gas experiments was to gain a better understanding of the physiological and pathological effects of mustard gas exposure. The Nazis sought to improve the effectiveness of chemical weapons for potential use on the battlefield. 2. Selection of victims. Inmates from concentration camps, particularly Sachsenhausen and Natzweiler-Struthof, were selected as subjects for these experiments. These victims were already subjected to dehumanizing conditions, and the experiments added another layer of cruelty to their suffering. 3. Administration of mustard gas. The victims were exposed to mustard gas in various ways, including inhalation, skin exposure, and ingestion. Some were made to stand in chambers filled with mustard gas, while others had the substance applied directly to their skin. The experiments aimed to study the different ways the human body could be affected by mustard gas exposure. 4. Observation of symptoms. The scientists closely observed the symptoms and effects of mustard gas on the victims. Mustard gas causes severe burns, blistering, respiratory issues, and internal organ damage. The experiments sought to document the progression of these symptoms under different conditions and concentrations. 5. Withholding treatment. One particularly cruel aspect of the experiments was the intentional withholding of medical treatment. The scientists wanted to observe the natural course of the injuries caused by mustard gas without any intervention, further emphasizing the disregard for the well-being of the victims. 6. High mortality rate. The experiments often resulted in death. Due to the toxic effects of mustard gas, many victims succumb to respiratory failure, organ damage, or infections resulting from the severe burns caused by the gas. The mortality rate among those subjected to the experiments was tragically high. 7. Lack of scientific validity. Similar to other Nazi experiments, the mustard gas experiments lacked scientific validity. The methods used were brutal and did not adhere to ethical or scientific standards. The results obtained were of limited practical value and served more as a demonstration of the Nazis' willingness to commit atrocities than as legitimate scientific research. The mustard gas experiments, along with other wartime atrocities, underscore the ethical failures and moral bankruptcy of those who conducted them. Remembering these historical horrors is crucial to prevent the recurrence of such inhumane acts and to honor the memory of the victims.